Good morning, all. I'm humbled by this opportunity to speak to a room full of such passionate youth and those of you who are still young at heart. My name is Gardi. I'm passionate about equality and justice, and behind my passion, there is a story. I'm originally Kurdish. We're the world's largest nation without a state, one of the most oppressed people. There are approximately 40 million Kurds all around the world, and we still don't have a state. My parents are political activists or freedom fighters, depending on which side you're on. They fought against the persecution of Kurds. They fought for Kurdish rights and independence. In the 80s, with the Iran-Iraq tension, Saddam Hussein's genocidal campaign against the Kurds, and all vestige of Kurdish existence banned in Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, it was a dangerous time to be Kurdish. My parents were forced to either flee or risk death. So they found themselves illegally crossing the border in the back of a cargo truck into Pakistan, where the presence of UN provided a beacon of hope. They were told it would be 6 months before they were resettled. It ended up being 9 years. That's me. I didn't choose to be a refugee. I was born as a refugee in a refugee camp in Pakistan. I've experienced life firsthand as a refugee in crowded UN camps, the unpredictability of life, the constant threat of danger, not knowing when or where you're going next, whether you'll have access to basics such as water, shelter, food, let alone education. The endless mass protests, abuse at the hands of local authorities, and seeing my father imprisoned for 6 months merely for peaceful protesting, and my mother selling all her jewelry to provide for us. Seeing people die from hunger strikes, and this is all as a child. How many of you in this room have a sibling? Please raise your hands if you have a sibling. If your parents had to choose only one of you to go to school, which one of you would it be? But what would happen to the other one? Only 1 in 2 refugee children get an education. We take it for granted how fortunate we are in New Zealand to have the option to go to school, the option to go to university. There are millions of people all around the world who would do anything to be in our position. When children are forced to flee, it takes off years of their schooling, and without an education, an entire generation is at risk. When I first came to New Zealand, I didn't speak a word of English. It was really difficult because English was my 4th language and my 4th alphabet. So it was quite difficult in that respect, but at the same time, I was really surprised as to how the teachers were so nice. You see, in Pakistan, I was used to learning due to fear. Teachers would hit us and beat us with sticks, and I remember being dragged across the classroom by my ponytail just for getting the pronunciation of a word wrong. If I hadn't been resettled in New Zealand, I could have just been a statistic. A statistic about how many different refugees are forced to flee from their homes. A statistic about how many young children don't have the basics such as food, water, and shelter to survive. A statistic about how many young refugees dream of an education. A statistic about how many refugees die every day trying to reach safety. I feel privileged to be resettled in New Zealand. The only difference between me and millions of refugees worldwide is that I was fortunate enough to be resettled in a place like New Zealand and to receive an education. Just during this speech, my maths is not so good, that's why I'm a lawyer, but by my estimation, about 150 plus will be displaced just during my speech. I realized my passion to help people when I worked as an intern at the United Nations headquarters in Africa. I worked on housing and slum upgrading projects in Kibera, one of the largest slums in the world. I didn't feel like I was making a difference at all when I was sitting at my desk in front of a computer. However, I only realized how the pieces all fit together and play a role in effectuating real change when I visited Kibera. I may have played only a very minor role, but when the pieces of the puzzle all come together, the bigger picture is extraordinary. I recently helped the University of Auckland establish a scholarship for refugees. By sharing my story and appealing to alumni and donors, we managed to raise enough funds to support 3 refugees for the next 6 years to have a scholarship to attend the University of Auckland. I recently represented New Zealand at the Global Refugee Youth Consultations in Geneva. This was the first time in history that the UNHCR gathered so many refugee youth all in one place to discuss and come up with solutions to address all the challenges that refugee youth face globally. There I met 2 young men from the Democratic Republic of Congo, living in refugee camps in Uganda. These 2 young men formed an organization, the Kobarwa's International Youth Organization to Transform Africa, or CIOTA for short, because it's quite long. CIOTA supports and advocates quality education for young refugee students in Uganda. Until 2005, only 3 young refugees had made it to Senior 5. Today, these 2 young men and their organization have supported over 600 people, young refugees, complete secondary education. This is just one example of youth leadership and the impact youth can have when they implement their ideas and try to make a change. They formed this organization with limited funding, literally straight from their refugee camps. So it made me wonder, what could we do in a place like New Zealand? Since meeting them in June, I've been feeling very inspired and been working on a mentoring program in New Zealand to try address the underrepresentation of refugees in tertiary education. We haven't formally launched, but Refugeniuses is going to be a mentoring program to support young refugees from the transition from high school to university. Sometimes it's the most simple things like enrollment, choosing classes, the application process, which can be so daunting when you've never ever known anyone that's been to university. I know how that feels because I was the first in my family to finish high school and to finish university. Thank you. So it'll be a peer-to-peer mentoring program to help refugee youth throughout their university education. Because it is simply just the dream of refugees to have education, and sometimes that can be the most difficult thing, yet often we take it for granted. Too often we hear buzzwords like future leaders. We are all already leaders. We are all already in a position to make a real difference in the world we live in. For what cause and how big or small that may be, only you can decide. But what role will you play? What will you do to help your community? What will you do to make the world we live in a better place? Champions are people who are not afraid to face difficulty. They're defined by strength, passion, and confidence. We can all be champions, but our task is to discover and unlock our greatness. We don't have to wait until we're in the prime of our careers. We can all do something right now. Empowered youths transform societies, and we can all be champions of change. Thank you.